Hello, everybody. Welcome to the UMassSafe CV-STAC webinar series on innovative initiatives in CDL compliance and safety. Really glad to have you here today. My name is Robin Reisman. I'm the director of UMassSafe. Welcome. Today we have the fifth in the 9-part webinar series. If you're interested in information on the previous webinars or in the upcoming webinars, feel free to go to the CV-STAC website. I think we posted the address in the chat line. There you can find the recordings and presentations from the 4 webinars that have occurred, as well as the schedule for the next couple of upcoming webinars. In addition, we keep updating the CV-STAC website with additional information, so we encourage you to go there often to find new information. So today we have with us Jennifer Walton. She's from the Kentucky Transportation Center at the University of Kentucky, and she's presenting on a project regarding enhanced safety screening for high-risk motor carriers. So in this presentation, she's going to demonstrate how Kentucky is using the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's basic scores to identify high-risk motor carriers for inspection. And Jennifer will describe how Kentucky incorporated these scores into their Seaview and roadside screening systems, and how the Kentucky State Police are using the information roadside. After the presentation, there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. If you think about things that you want to ask Jennifer while she's presenting, feel free to type them into the chat box, and that way we'll have those questions queued up when she's finished. Let me just share with you a little bit about Jennifer, and then she'll get started. Jennifer Walton currently serves as the Intelligent Transportation Systems Program Manager for the Kentucky Transportation Center at the University of Kentucky. She has more than 21 years of experience with project management, research, and training in the ITS field. Her primary areas of expertise are in commercial vehicle screening technologies, as well as driver and vehicle regulations and traffic incident management. She assists the state of Kentucky with research, planning, program management, data quality, and implementation of various commercial vehicle-related ITS projects. She played a key role in the development and management and implementation of the Kentucky Automated Truck Screening System called CATS. Jennifer's received her bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering from the University of Kentucky, and obtained her professional engineering license from Kentucky in 2001. And she'll be sharing more about this roadside screening system. So without further ado, here is Jennifer Walton.
Good afternoon. I'm going to share my presentation with you. Hopefully you can all see that. So today I'm going to present on how Kentucky has taken safety data and incorporated it into our screening systems and provided it to commercial vehicle enforcement. And I want to go ahead and say I've got a colleague with me, Lettie, who is working on this project with me and has been involved in a lot of the data analysis, and is going to be available to answer questions toward the end, should there be some specific questions about the data analysis. So to get started, I just wanted to give you a little bit about a little background about our agency. I work with the Kentucky Transportation Center. We are located in the College of Engineering at the University of Kentucky, and we are the designated research arm for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. We have 11 different program areas here at the center. Traffic and safety is one of those, structures is one of those, training is another. The program that I am over is Intelligent Transportation Systems, and our focus for several years now has been in the commercial vehicle area. So we do work in other areas of ITS, but primarily we've been focused in commercial vehicles. So we play a role really since they started with the C-Vision, or the Innovative Technology Deployment Program within Kentucky. And I think this was mentioned in the introduction, but just to kind of give you an idea of our background, we are tightly involved with the Innovative Technology Deployment Program in Kentucky. We prepare their strategic plans each year. We document performance measures for the group, prepare grant applications, do various investigations and evaluations of technologies and systems. We monitor data quality and work to resolve those issues. We're involved with training on the screening systems, both for enforcement and those who are in the Division of Motor Carriers. And then we also are heavily involved with the implementation and support of various commercial vehicle technologies. And this is a look at our C-Vision or ITD team. I tend to go back to the C-Vision term quite a bit, but the new term now is Innovative Technology Deployment, or ITD. This is our team. It's composed of Kentucky State Police, Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, which is where our Division of Motor Carriers is housed. We also have other representatives from transportation. We have the trucking industry represented. Federal Motor Carriers is represented as well. So, there's a note here on this slide that says 2018 Strategic Planning Meeting. We meet once a year to brainstorm ideas for this group. What's the direction that we want to go in? What do we want to focus on? And that really transitions me to the next step, which is one of the topics that has risen recently is implementing more safety into our screening. So this project was something that was generated at that strategic planning meeting, and it was funded through the 2017 High Priority Grant. What we're seeking to do is incorporate the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's basic scores into screening systems, so that we can more easily identify carriers that could have safety problems. And ultimate goal here is to take unsafe carriers off the roadway. And some of the performance measures that we are looking at or considering are being able to do an inspection that's going to have more violations on it or have more out of service violations on it. So that's the performance measure that we intend to look at to see if this project is successful. We started this project in September of last year, and we hope to wrap it up by the end of this year. So I'm going to kind of just go through what we're doing. The role that we play at the center is we are facilitating the development of the functional requirements, and we will develop the functional requirements for the test. It will be based on input from a committee that we have pulled together. The picture that you saw earlier is our entire team, and this committee is basically a subset of that. Some of the key players are from KSP, our Kentucky State Police, from Federal Motor Carriers, and from the Transportation Cabinet. So after we get the functional requirements developed, we will work with the programmer who implements our changes in Seaview and CATS, and we will make sure that those changes are implemented as we want them to be, and then we'll work with enforcement to test the new features. And we suspect, and we've already really come across that it will require some going back and forth and making some changes. And then what we want to do at the end is evaluate this new screening to see what the benefits are and share that with others. So just to kind of give you an introduction, I'm not completely sure about the background of the folks that are able to be on the webinar today. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background, I wanted to show you a snapshot. This is a screenshot from our Kentucky Seaview. And then I'm going to give you, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, but I also want to give you a screenshot from our Kentucky Automated Truck Screening System, which is our roadside screening system. So just a screenshot there from both of those. The Seaview, or the Commercial Vehicle Information Exchange window that we use, is a part of the Innovative Technology Deployment Program. This is the screenshot you saw is Kentucky's Seaview. And basically, in simple terms, it houses data. And that's putting it very simply. It's actually pretty complex, but it houses federal, state data on carriers and vehicles. And pertaining to this project in general, there's company level information available for all US and Canadian carriers. Beyond just being kind of a data warehouse of information, our Seaview can be utilized to verify screening information, and also can be kind of used as a second level of screening. We have, I think we currently have 12 tests that we run. So every time someone queries our Seaview, these 12 tests are ran and a pass-fail is generated for those. And it just allows our enforcement and our motor carriers to, before they issue credentials or before they do an inspection or write a citation, that they have a big picture of all the potential problems that may exist with the carrier or the vehicle that they have in front of them. So this is an overview just to kind of give you an idea of how critical the Seaview is in Kentucky in terms of commercial vehicle operations. It's really the center of activity for us. It contains Kentucky-specific data that you won't see in other states, but it also contains that federal level data and the data that other states share to SAFER. And then you'll also see arrows that, many of these arrows push out data. Our roadside systems use the Seaview as a source of data. So it's a really key part of our program here, is that Seaview and the data that's available through that Seaview. And an example of a system that uses our Seaview is what we refer to as CATS, short for Kentucky Automated Truck Screening. And I know there's several states that have systems out there that are like this. We are basically, as trucks come through or pass a CAT system, we are trying to identify the license plate number and jurisdiction, and we're trying to get the USDOT number from the truck so that we can identify the company and the vehicle. And then we're going to use our Seaview data to find out things about that company and that vehicle. I'm sure, as is in the case in many locations, we have thousands of trucks coming through our facilities, going across our roadways every day, and we have a limited number of people who can do inspections and look at these vehicles. So the goal with this technology, this roadside screening system, is to be more efficient with available staffing. We want to help them identify good candidates for inspection, and that can be based on a number of things. For the purposes of this presentation, we're specifically looking at safety. How can we put good candidates for inspection that may have safety problems that we want off the roadway? How can we identify those for our enforcement? So what we have found, and we have, our first CAT system was implemented in 2010. What we have found is that we see improvements in safety and compliance with other laws and regulations when we're able to use this system to make stops and identify vehicles for inspection. So one of the great things, or one of the things that we really appreciate about this type of technology, as opposed to like a transponder-based system, is that motor carriers don't have to volunteer to participate. If they pass by one of our CAT sites, we're going to attempt to identify that company and vehicle and screen that company and vehicle. As I said, our first system was implemented in 2010, and we saw such good results from it that we now have 16 CAT sites located around our state, and this just kind of gives you an idea where they are. 13 of those are either inside a facility on a ramp, or they are on the main line right before a way station and tied to that way station. 3 of them are in remote locations. So kind of tying it back, we're able to do this screening that we're going to talk about here in all of these locations, utilizing the Seaview and the CAT systems. And to give you a little bit of background, so we have been doing safety-related commercial vehicle screening in Kentucky. Years ago, we were using, perhaps some of you remember out there, we were using a PRISM designation of either A, B, or C. PRISM would denote those carriers that fell into those categories. And we had, our enforcement group had quite a bit of success when they stopped PRISM A carriers in particular with finding safety problems and violations. That system eventually went away and is no longer being utilized by the PRISM program. So the other things that we have been doing are looking at federal out of service. Is the carrier under a federal out of service? We've been looking at US DOT status. And then perhaps something that might be a little unique to you that are out there doing enforcement is we do look at historical data for the company based on vehicle out of service, driver out of service, and hazmat out of service rates. We're looking at, I believe it's 2 years worth of inspection data. And if the vehicle out of service rate, driver out of service rate, etc., if those are above certain thresholds based on the historic data, then we flag those carriers for inspection. So the new thing that we are doing now is something that we've really wanted to do for a while and just have never made the step into that. And that is to use specifically the basics. But what we've also learned is we want to know more and do more with the ISS score as well. So back in October, we started making some changes to our screening systems to CATS and Seaview. This next slide talks about where we're getting the data. So if you're part of the Innovative Technology Deployment Program, and I know there's a lot of states that are, if you're part of that program, then you can get this data from SAFER as well. We're using the T31 file, which is called the MICMAS Safety and Census file, to get all of the data that we're talking about. And what I have found and what we've learned in going through this process is we've had access to this data for a long time. We just haven't been using all of this data. And so now we're trying to do that. But if you're part of the ITD program, this is something that you do have access to and that you can use as well. We are specifically looking at, I'm going to talk about the ISS score, which is something that Kentucky has used and been a part of our systems for some time. As far as the score is, but we also have picked up another piece of information tied to that, which is the ISS indicator. And related to the basics, there are 7 categories, and we're picking up all the scores and alerts now for the 7 basics that you see listed there. And just added a couple of things here. So, and most of you may already know this, but I think it's important to note that the ISS score itself is actually based on the basic scores and the sufficiency of data. And that's putting it very simply. It's not a simple score at all. There's a algorithm associated with that score. There's actually 2 algorithms associated with that score. So I'm putting it in very, very simple terms, but it is important to note that the ISS is based on the basics. So what are the basics based upon? They're based upon inspections. What were the driver and vehicle inspection or violations on the inspections for this company? It's based on crash reports, and it's also based on investigation results. I'm going to give you a few examples of the data that we have available. So again, just as a reminder, in general, our Seaview is used as a secondary form of screening after we already have a truck stopped. It's used to verify information. It's used to supplement information from that first screening. Or maybe just a stop is made without a screening tool, and they utilize this to check certain things about a carrier. With regard to safety, the basics are displayed in our Seaview, and this is just an example of what that looks like. I took off the company information, so all you're seeing here are scores. But we highlight things that are in a problem area. So we can see for this particular carrier, we have a deficiency in hours of service compliance and vehicle maintenance. And it shows the score in both those areas as well. And again, this is just how we've incorporated the basics into our Seaview, what it looks like. These are 2 different examples. I just pulled them on the same screen here, but 2 different examples we recently added where you see ISS2 indicator. This is a new field that we just added over the last month to our Seaview. Because in general, when we look at the ISS score, there are 2 categories. There is those who have been rated based on their safety, and there's those who have been rated or scored based on their lack of data. So we don't have enough data about this particular carrier to really say much about their safety. So instead, we've got a score related to the fact that we need to do more inspections so we have data. So for these 2 different carriers, you see the first one has a 63 score. And for that score, they've received this score because they have insufficient data. Another carrier, different carrier that we looked at, had a score of 85, and that score was based on safety. I'll note that the highlighting that you see right now, the way that it works in our Seaview is if you are a 75 or above, which is in the inspect category according to FMCSA, then you're going to be red. And that's the red highlighting you see on the 85. If you are in the 50 to 74 category, you're going to be highlighted in yellow. Those are the ones that we would like inspections on, or that FMCSA would like inspections on, but it is optional. Okay, another example of how we've incorporated and pulled in the basics. This is kind of the big picture. You see the table with the basics. You see the score at the top. This particular carrier has a 99, and it's based on safety. And you can see just by looking at the table, there's several deficiencies there. And that's what you would expect to see with this high of a score that's based on safety. Now this next screen is from our CAT system. So these are the screens that our enforcement officers and inspectors have access to when they're utilizing our systems. They have the ability to adjust their screening rules. With regard to safety, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this is actually taken from the CAT screen. these were the safety areas that we focused on previously: DOT status, driver out of service, federal out of service, hazmat, and then vehicle out of service. So we still have those in our CAT system, but we've added the ability for inspectors and officers to flag trucks based on basics. So what we did, and this was a preliminary, let's put this out there, let's see how they use it, let's see how it works. And so we've had this out there probably since October. And I can tell you now that we're sure that we're going to be changing how this works, but this is how it's out there right now. So I'm going to describe it and show it to you. And they have two things they can do with all of these basics. They can use the default threshold, which is based on FMCSA's alerts for a carrier. So FMCSA in the T31 file has already put an alert on carriers that either have an investigation deficiency or that have a score that is deficient. And it's a really good thing that they have that, because the scores, where they are deficient, where a carrier is deficient, depends on the type of carrier and it depends on the basics. So the score is not always the same number that would make them deficient. So it's really nice that that data already has the alerts built in. To give you just a little bit more information again, they have the choice roadside to either use the default thresholds that FMCSA puts alerts on, or they can use their own threshold for any of the basics. And what we found relatively quickly was that the alerts that are associated with companies, according to the basics, there's a really high number of carriers that have some sort of alert, and using that roadside was very problematic. We were flagging way too many trucks for it to be useful. So we learned very quickly that we need to dial that back. One of the ways they can do it right now is by using the user threshold instead of the default threshold. Let me go back one more time. So on this screen here where you see user threshold, this screening system has been set to 90. And that means that the basic score must be at least 90 or higher, or we won't fail the carrier for that particular basic. What we have since come to is that it probably needs to be set even higher than that to keep from having too many trucks flagged in the system. So, and let me give you a couple of examples. Now, this is a screenshot from the CAT system, and this was done back in October. So shortly after we implemented, one of these trucks here, this one, got a fail for a basic in vehicle maintenance. And you may not be able to read the fine print there, but the fail tells us that they exceeded the user threshold. So we had, apparently the user threshold was set to 90. This carrier has a score of at least 90 in the vehicle maintenance area. Corresponding to that truck is data from our Seaview, and you can see that in the vehicle maintenance area, they have an on-road performance score of 91, and that is why they failed for vehicle maintenance. You'll also notice that hours of service is alerting. It is deficient by the FMCSA guidelines, but because the user threshold was in place, it didn't get flagged roadside. It would have had to have had a higher score to get flagged roadside. Another example truck that came through one of our facilities failed for basics in hours of service, unsafe driving, and vehicle maintenance. Again, all set user threshold to 90. If we go to our Seaview, we should find corresponding data that supports that, and we do. Unsafe driving, hours of service, compliance, and vehicle maintenance all have scores over 90, and that's what we would expect to see. And just another example, this time the areas are driver fitness, hours of service, compliance, and unsafe driving. This time we have our threshold set a little differently. You'll see, if you notice where the fails are located on the screen in the screenshot, you'll see a 95, an 89, and a 95. So we have modified those user thresholds for the different categories. And what we see in the Seaview is that those should have been flagged in CATs. So that is all working kind of how we intended it. But what we found, as I said earlier, what we found really quickly was that the alerts that are in the T31 file, there are way too many carriers that have those alerts for us to use that as a roadside screening tool. So it's great information once you have the truck stopped. It's definitely things that you want to look at. But in terms of trying to screen the trucks before you stop them, there's just too many vehicles falling into that category. So what we're doing now, we are taking feedback from enforcement. We already have learned that they are going to be, for now, just using the user default and setting the number. And they can do that at each location. They can set those numbers. They can change it every day if they want. They can focus on specific basic categories at each of the locations as they want. So for now, that's what's in place. And what we're doing in the meantime is we're collecting and analyzing data to help inform us on how to best modify these tests. So currently we are analyzing inspection data, Kentucky inspection data based on the ISS score and the indicator, as well as basics. And I'm going to show you a few slides here in a minute to give you an idea of what we're seeing. Beyond that, what we will be doing next is also analyzing observation data to determine the appropriate thresholds to use for screening. And just to explain that a little bit more, so with our CAT systems, we capture images, we identify these companies and vehicles, and we save that data into an observation warehouse, basically. So we have a record of companies and vehicles that are going through our facilities or going through a CAT site, not necessarily just a facility, because we do have some in remote locations. So what that gives us is, it gives us a better idea of what the population of truck traffic looks like that we're seeing on a regular basis. So we can analyze that data and figure out how many of these carriers fall into certain categories. And by doing that, it will allow us to set the parameters in such a way that we're not constantly alarming at our CAT sites. We've done this long enough to know that if we alarm too often, it becomes just too much of a habit of hearing it go off and it doesn't get their attention. So what we want to do is set this in a way that it will alarm just enough that they'll have time to actually look at them and be able to take some of those as their inspections. We don't want to overwhelm them with too much data. So we're trying to figure out how we want to set our screening rules, and then we think looking at the inspection data and the observation data is going to help us do that. So in terms of what we're seeing right now, this graph shows, this is for inspections in Kentucky in January. It's only 1 month of data. We're looking at about 4,800 inspections. But it groups those inspections by ISS score. So where you see the numbers there across the bottom, those are ISS scores. And we group together the inspections for carriers that fall into that score. And then on the y-axis, what you see are number of violations per inspection. And there's different types of violations that we looked at. The line across the top is just total violations. So, and I'm going to primarily speak to that, although you see that the lines are very similar. They follow a similar pattern in a lot of ways. But what you see with this chart, there is a general trend where the higher scores have higher violations per inspection, but there's also a lot of areas where we're seeing spikes that are not necessarily with a score that we would expect. For instance, around the 45 to 50 area, there's a spike there, and it's actually the biggest spike on our chart. But that is in the category that FMCSA considers a pass that doesn't need an inspection. But in the data that we looked at, we actually saw more violations per inspection in this category. And you see those same sort of spikes occurring in different areas associated with different scores. So the first thing I would say is we have a limited amount of data, and we're going to be collecting more data to see what this line ends up looking like. Our initial assumptions were that we thought the 75 and above would have much more violations on the inspections, but in a few months after we get additional data, we'll be reevaluating what we're seeing. But for now, we're seeing lots of spikes in different areas. So we can't necessarily say that the higher the ISS score, the more safety issues necessarily, or the more violations that we're going to find on our inspections. The next thing that we looked at was not just the ISS score, but the ISS scores for those carriers that had a safety-based score. So again, there are two different ways to calculate the ISS score. One is based on safety, and one is based on insufficient data. So this graph shows us for carriers that were scored based on their safety. This is the number of violations per inspection that we saw. And again, the trend line does show an increase as the score goes higher, but we still see spikes in particular areas that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see them. So for now, this is just kind of interesting. We want to collect more data to see what happens as we have more data points. Another really interesting thing, though, that we saw early on, this again, January data, it is ISS score when we didn't have sufficient data for the carrier. So FMCSA has indicated they don't have enough data on these carriers. These scores are done differently, and you'll notice on the x-axis, it only goes to 50 for one thing. There are no carriers that are scored under 50. All of these are carriers that they would like to have inspections on because we don't have enough inspections on these carriers. But you also see there's only above 70, 75 and higher, the only scores that are being assigned are 99 and 100. So most of these scores fall in between 50 and 74, with the exception of 100 and 90. And 100 is out of service carriers, and 99 is they're random. So they do have random carriers in this category that are assigned a 99 in hopes of getting them inspected more quickly. But the interesting thing that we saw here, if you look at the y-axis, number of violations per inspection ended up being overall on average about twice as much. So twice as many violations per inspection when we did an inspection on a carrier that had an ISS score that was based on insufficient data, as opposed to the ones that were based on safety. So again, it's really early, but this is the data that we're seeing right now. We want to collect more data to figure out if that's going to hold, if that thought or idea will hold. We also, and we have just started doing this, so I'm going to show you two of the basics, but we also looked at the inspections that were done in January based on the basic scores. This graph is for vehicle maintenance. And again, you see the scores across the bottom. This one does actually fit the trend line a little bit better. As the scores go up, we do tend to see more violations per inspection. But as you can see there, toward the very top of the scores, around 98, we see a pretty big jump, a significant jump in the number of violations per inspection. Okay, one more chart. This one is for the hours of service compliance. And again, we do in general see a trend upward as the score goes higher. We see more violations per inspection. This one's not as dramatic probably as the other one. And then again, too, we do see at the very top end of the scores, we see a significant jump up for inspections, or I'm sorry, for violations per inspection. So just kind of going back over some of the early findings, we were using ISS score in Kentucky as information when we stopped carriers, but we were not providing them with the information about the indicator, which is whether that score was based on safety or insufficient data. And we've already actually incorporated that change, and you saw some of that in the earlier screenshots. So that's something we've done since we started this project. So now when they see the ISS score, they see either the safety, it was based on safety, or they see that it was based on insufficient data. We do have to, and we will be doing training to make sure that they understand what they're looking at now when we provide this data to them. Another finding kind of early on is that those default thresholds that are in, those alerts that are in the T31 file, there's really too many vehicles there for us to use that for screening purposes. Also kind of what we've come to working with the enforcement and working with our committee is that not only do we want to provide them screening that would help them identify high risk just in general and high risk carrier, but we also want to provide them with the ability to focus on specific areas. They really like the idea of having the ability to focus on hours of service or vehicle maintenance or a combination of those two. Maybe they're doing kind of a focus on drugs and alcohol, and they want to focus on that at a particular CAT site. So we're going to really, in the end, be doing two things. And one is hopefully giving them that, in general, high-risk carrier that they can look at, but also the ability to be flexible with their screening and pick a specific basic area to focus on. Another key finding, and again, these are early on, is the number of violations per inspection did increase with the basic scores. And we've only got two examples there for you, but we are seeing the higher the basic score, the higher the number of violations per inspection. Another early finding that I mentioned earlier, the average violation rates do not seem to correlate with the ISS categories of inspect, optional, and pass. And again, what I mean by that is we see, if we look at our inspection data, we see carriers in the pass category and the optional category that are having significant numbers of violations on their inspections. And another finding, choosing a truck for inspection with an ISS score based on the sufficiency of data may actually result in more violations per inspection than focusing on the ones that were scored based on their safety history. That wasn't really intuitive to us. We didn't expect that. And additional data collection may disprove that right now, there is some interest in actually possibly flagging some of those specific carriers that are in the category of insufficient data. So again, what we're doing right now, we've got the screening tools out there for them, but we know that we're going to be tweaking them. We're collecting and analyzing this data. We've got a month's worth of data that we've already analyzed. We would like to have 3 to 6 months of data before we make changes to our screening system. And when we do make those changes, we will be rolling that out and then working with our programmer and also our enforcement officers to see how it works. Does it need to be tweaked anymore? And then finally, what we want to do before the end of the project is, after we get it to where we get the screening tools the way that we want them, we'd like to do an evaluation and look at, you know, in the inspections to see, are we getting more violations per inspection when we look at these types of things? Are we seeing increased out of service violations using this tool? We want to be able to document that and share the benefits with other states and FMCSA. And that, I think, concludes my presentation. If anyone has questions.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Really interesting presentation. I encourage folks to either unmute themselves to ask a question or to type a question into the chat box. And to get us started, I have one. I was really interested in your discussion about how to make this user-friendly and to find the right balance of data to not overwhelm the inspectors, but to give them the data that they needed. What role did law enforcement play in the development of the tool?
So, pretty key role, I would say. I was just kind of trying to think back. When we first started this, we had one of the captains from one of our enforcement regions that played a key role in defining how it would work. We also had a key person from FMCSA who was very familiar with the basics, how they worked. They really educated us on kind of the direction that we needed to go on. So they've played a key role from the beginning and will continue to. We have a small working group that includes the one representative from our local FMCSA office, and it includes an enforcement a lieutenant from the compliance review area of Kentucky State Police, and then ourselves. But we're kind of the group that is sorting through all of this information and looking at the data and trying to make decisions. But once we roll out the version of the screening that we think is appropriate, we will be working again with that same captain back at one location to really make they'll be making stops and doing inspections and verifying that what we think we should see is what we actually see, and that it's a valuable tool.
That sounds great. I think that interaction and feedback is such a key part of the project. Have law enforcement needed training in order to understand how to use the tool?
That's a good question. We did end up rolling out the screening to all the facilities. We've actually only done really any kind of specific training at one location. So what I suspect is probably happening at many of the locations is, I think many of them they're going to be familiar with what the ISS score is and the basics.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new test that we've added. So I do know that some of them have tried it out. It doesn't really require much training yet in terms of using the screening tool. One thing that we haven't trained on yet that we do need to train on and that we hope to do soon is the additional data that we are now displaying in our Seaview related to ISS. Again, they were used to just seeing an ISS score, and now we're also giving them the safety or the insufficient data indicator. So that's something that we do need to do training on soon. And then eventually, once we get this screening to where we want it, we actually have a annual training program for our enforcement officers and inspectors. Every year we go do training on the Seaview and our screening systems. So we'll incorporate that as a part of the training that we regularly do on an annual basis.
Excellent. I think it speaks to how user-friendly it is that training hasn't been needed for so many components. I think also the flexibility in the tool is really interesting, like the default thresholds versus their own thresholds. Just a lot of key pieces that you took into consideration in developing it. Do other folks have any questions? Well, Jennifer, thank you very much for the presentation. We will be posting it on the CV-STAC website, so if folks are interested in going back and listening to a piece again, or know of somebody else that was interested but wasn't able to attend, the recording will be posted there as well as the slides. Thank you, Jennifer. Really appreciate your time. Next week, we're going to have another webinar, so we encourage you folks to join us again if you're able. The topic for next week is autonomous vehicles and CDL, legislation and regulatory implications. And our speaker next week is from Massachusetts. He's the CDL coordinator with the Registry of Motor Vehicles, Bob Rowland, and he has a lot to say. I think it'll be a really interesting presentation. Again, we encourage folks to fill out the survey if you can and give us some feedback on these webinars and on CV-STAC. The link to the survey is on the screen in the chat box. So if you're able, that would be really helpful. And thanks again, Jennifer.